Matar's two novels to date, In the Country of Men, published in 2006, and Anatomy of a Disappearance, published earlier this year, carry strong resonances of these autobiographical facts. The first novel is set in Libya and partly in Egypt. The second is set in Egypt, England, and portions of it are also set in Switzerland. But there are the motifs of a dissident father who is either imprisoned or disappeared, and the impact of that on a son, in both cases an only child, who lives in exile. Yet again, it should be emphasized that the two novels are richly accomplished fictional works that have garnered much acclaim. In the Country of Men was nominated for the 2006 Man Booker Award and the Guardian Book Award, and it went on to win the 2007 Royal Society of Literature Otachi Prize and the 2007 National Book Critics Circle Award. Matar, who is currently an associate professor at Barnard College in New York City, has also published a great deal in such forums as The Guardian, The New Yorker, and The New York Times. In an interview with Jadaliya, when asked about his choice to write in English, this was what he says. No, I don't think about writing in Arabic. I don't write in Arabic. Do I feel something was lost? Possibly, but I also think something was gained. Writing in English allows that sort of distance. I struggle with it. It's not something that sits completely easily with me. At a talk he gave at the Edinburgh International Book Festival in August, Matar reflected that, for the first time in our history, the idea of democracy is a real, tangible idea, not a fairy tale. Revolutions aren't about negative objectives, about simply getting rid of people. They are about discovering who we are and what it means to be Libyans. Please join me in welcoming Hisham.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. And thanks to Alwan for hosting the event. And thanks so much for Hala and for this very flattering introduction. I will give a short reading from In the Country of Men first. Then Hal and I decided that we'll have a chat, and then I'll give another reading from Anatomy of a Disappearance. So this passage that I will read is when the protagonist of In the Country of Men, who's a young boy, his name is Suleiman, he and his mother wander across the street to the house of Ustad Jafar, who is a very senior member of the Libyan Barat, and not necessarily a family that they are close to, but in order and desperation to solicit the help of these important people in finding Suleiman's father. Ustad Jafar, like most government officials, kept us waiting. No, I'm not going to start here. I'm going to start one paragraph before, for a good reason. That visit has remained with me ever since. Whenever I'm faced with someone who holds the strings of my fate, an immigration officer, a professor, I can feel the distant reverberations from that day, my inauguration into the dark art of submission. Perhaps this is why I often find a shameful pleasure in submitting to authority. Even in prayer, bowing down, my head pressed against the ground, my back arching beneath its own weight, my chest falling between my shoulders, my hands flat against the ground, fingers pressed tightly together, hearing my own whispered prayers, I'm often overcome with regret and, yes, shame that I am gloating in it, enjoying my own deprecation. And this is also why, when I finally think I have gained the pleasure of authority, a sense of self-loathing rises to clasp me by the throat. I have always been able to imagine being unjustifiably hated. Ustad Jafar, like most government officials, kept us waiting. We sat in the reception room where the face of the guide, not a name for Gaddafi, stared down at us from a photograph that was much smaller than the one Musa hung in our house. The room was done up in the color of the revolution, the walls pale green, the furniture upholstered in darker green fabric, still covered in plastic, so that when you squirmed it made the sound of a fart, and you had to squirm again to prove that you hadn't actually farted. A small coffee table stood in the middle where it couldn't be easily reached. On it there was an empty ashtray and a tissue box with one pink tissue shooting out of it, closely followed by a yellow one. The curtains were drawn, they were also green, and a weak light burnt in a small chandelier above the coffee table. A huge television stood in one corner. It was perhaps as large as my piano. Perhaps Mama sat upright, her knees touching, her hands wrestling with each other. Every time the blood rushed back into one, she would rub it out again. Mas'ud walked in and sat beside her. "He's coming," she said. Mama looked at her and nodded. "Why trouble yourself with a cake?" "It's nothing," Mama said. "We are neighbors," Mas'ud started, but then, to my astonishment, Mama began to cry. Mas'ud didn't seem surprised. She must be used to this, I thought. "In fact, I have been thinking, saying to Jafar," she went on, "why doesn't she come when she knows we can help? I know we haven't always seen eye to eye, but..." She leaned towards the coffee table and plucked the pink tissue. "I wanted to," Mama said, taking the tissue from Mas'ud's swollen fingers. "Never hesitate, we are sisters. I swear to God," Mama said, "I have always liked you." Her eyes wide open, eager to convince. "Don't worry," Mas'ud said lazily. Her confidence was repulsive. "Men are like that. They like adventure. The guide knows this, and he is very forgiving." "Really?" "Yes," Mas'ud reassured her, then, lowering her voice to a whisper, added, "Let me tell you this. Once a man was fixed on killing him." "Really?" Mama said, assuming disbelief. "Yes. What can you say? Mad. His mind had left him. When he was caught, the guide sat with him and asked, 'Why did you want to kill me, my son?' They say the man melted like ice and fire, weeping for forgiveness, and the guide forgave him there and then." Mama looked astonished, hopeful, ridiculously naive. Mas'ud plucked the yellow tissue and handed it to Mama. "I don't mean to brag, but Jafar has a special place in the guide's heart. And Jafar is, of course, heart and soul devoted to him. Yes, after all, isn't all this good fortune we are in," she said, opening her hands towards the ceiling, "because of his generosity? It wouldn't be right to bite the hand that feeds you." "Of course," Mama said, adding in the way people do at weddings, "May God nurture the goodwill and keep the envious at bay." "From your mouth to God's ear," Mas'ud said. Ustad Jafar rarely stood chatting with any of the neighbors. He wasn't unfriendly, but kept conversations to a minimum and always assumed the air of the sort of man I would later come to recognize, one who wanted to make the burden of his monumental responsibilities clear, that he was a man who was thrust by fate's benevolent hand into the vortex of his time. He greeted people with a sort of inverted modesty that seemed designed to make them feel humble. He was always dressed in a suit and tie, his hair blow-dried and parted so carefully to conceal the receding line. He wore gold-rimmed sunglasses, which he rarely took off when shaking hands with others. He didn't have to seem outwardly eager to prove his loyalty. He was a senior member of the Mukhabarat, trained in Moscow by the KGB, concerned with the larger picture, with the mechanics of security, calculating who was to remain in front of the sun and who to be fixed firmly behind it. Most of us children were led to fear him. Most of us secretly admired his power in comparison with our parents. No one of us didn't want to be in his shoes. He walked into his reception room where Mama and I sat waiting like patients at a doctor's surgery. Mama stood up, I did it. He came straight to me, ruffled my hair and said simply, Suleiman. I stood up, my eyes on Mama, hoping to deflect his gaze. How are you? Answer your uncle, Mama said. I faced the floor and mumbled, I'm fine, Ustad Jafar. This made him clap his hands and laugh. He finally turned to Mama. He shook her hand without looking at her face, repeating, sit down, sit down. Najwa has come especially to talk to you, Jafar, Mas'ud said in an unnecessarily loud voice, a smile lurking on her face. She is our dear neighbor. The Prophet taught us to love our neighbors. Of course, Ustad Jafar said benevolently. Thank you, Mama said, and repeated her statement, I swear I have always liked you. Adding that, Mas'ud and Ali are like my own. I swear there is no difference between them and Suleiman. Then, to my horror, she began crying again. Mas'ud looked at her husband and pursed her lips. She seemed to genuinely feel for Mama. Go and make us tea, he said quietly, and Mas'ud left the room. His tone changed when he addressed his wife. It was rough and unrestrained. I swear to you, Mas'ud, Mama said, these days are pure hell. He didn't ask what she meant. He seemed to know. He seemed to know everything. He's innocent. If he has done anything, it's because he was urged by others. Suleiman has always been devoted. He isn't the type. It's just that other people, may God forgive them, have been... Listen. I know, she said. But what can you say that the devil is mischievous? Then, with renewed hope, Mama said, I swear, since we found out about Rashid, we have had nothing to do with him or his family. She began to weep again. Please, Ustad, you must believe me, she said. There, he said, so softly that I felt a strange urge to hug him. God is great, capable of all things. And that was all he said. God is great and capable of all things.
Do you remember any instances, any similar instances yourself interacting with the Mukhabarat or any of the security apparatus in Libya?
No, I don't. What I remember, I mean, my life is very different from my protagonist's life, but what I do remember is the atmosphere of that time. Whereas Suleiman's life is very much isolated and his reality is encapsulated into the house and the street. In fact, the house is a sort of character in the book too. Mine was less so. I had a sibling, he doesn't, and a much more kind of vibrant and open social life, and which exposed me in some ways to knowing more about what other Libyans were going through. And so I used some of that. I used that kind of atmosphere. It's very curious, but for me, it's where things work. It's not when I'm trying to recollect an event or a particular incident, or to try to recall a character or a real character and write them up. Where things become alive and exciting for me as I'm writing is when I'm using, when I'm provoked by a kind of atmosphere or a kind of state, and then I make up the rest. That's when things are exciting. But certainly during that time, you know, there were lots of moments when, as children, we knew that there was something unusual taking place. So, you know, you're around a dinner table with lots of your uncles and your aunts, and then suddenly someone says something, and the adults all look at each other, and the conversation is interrupted because they were reminded there are children on the table. They might carry the conversation somewhere else. So there was a great deal of fear and anxiety.
I was wondering if you're influenced by Arabic novels of the same genre, which sort of speak in the first person singular, speak in a sort of a fictional, autobiographical sense of experiences of this sort. I can think of Mu'annis al-Razaz and his Ataraqat Katib Sawt, or Ahyat al-Bahr al-Mayyit, and there are of course many others. I'm wondering if you're sort of, if your novel is somehow influenced by these types of novels, or at least informed in your own literary sort of knowledge of Arabic novels?
It's a very good question. I mean, the question of influence is a curious one because it's impossible to answer it. You know, in the sense, it's impossible to know. I can't. You know, I've read those novels. I've read so many. I mean, I can't say that those writers have been the most important or central to my reading, but you know, so I wouldn't be able to know that. What I can say is that the work that has engaged me as a reader and as a writer, you know, I can name some of those, you know, but I don't see how those have influenced.
I guess perhaps I mischaracterized what I want to say. Ultimately, since part of the introduction spoke about your choice of writing in English as opposed to Arabic, but clearly you read Arabic, so my sense was, do you see this as a part of novels that have a sort of fictional autobiographical sense that already exist in Arabic with which you're familiar? Does it fit within the same genre in the way you imagine it?
Yeah.
Or that was sort of basically that you're in dialogue still, it seems to me, like, for genre in Arabic literature as well.
Yeah.
So even though you're not writing in Arabic.
Well, I hope so. I hope so. But I think you and readers in general, I think, are better placed to decide that. In the sense that I feel it is impossible for me to read my work, to decide where it is, or I have no access to it. You know, I'm in another place. Of course, you know, it's you know, I've read this book as I was writing it maybe 150 times, but in all of those times I haven't actually read it the way that you would be able to read it. So, and I've always found that interesting. Actually, I didn't expect that when I started writing. I expected that I would have authority over the text as a writer, being the author. And I don't feel that at all. It's locked away from me.
Well, what do you feel?
Sorry?
What do you feel, if not authority?
Maybe in service, you know, when I'm writing. I mean, right now I feel very far away from it. But in writing, I do feel in service. I think one of the things that I've always found difficult about talking about writing is that writing is not, writing is a place for me. It's not it's not necessarily an activity. You know, it can't be described in that sense. When I'm writing a book, the book and the writing of it is a geographical place. Once I'm finished, I've left that place, and I can't, with any authority or in any way that is precise or interesting, I feel, speak about it. The problem arises then when we say, why don't you speak about it while you're writing it? You know, the trouble with that is that because I'm a writer and because I'm speaking to you now in the same medium, words, language, it's a problem. You know, using language to speak about language. You know, I'm not a painter or a composer, whereby, you know, those people, when they speak about their work, they're actually using a completely different genre. Writers are unique in that sense, that you are using the same thing to talk about the thing. You know, which is why, partly, music has always been incredibly important for me. Maybe as important, and at times maybe slightly more important than reading, listening. Music is central to my life in general, but with more intensity when I'm writing, because it seems to be the only space where one can go and engage intellectually and emotionally, but without using the same thing.
That your life is very different from the protagonist. I thought of something that Madame, the 19th century French poet, said, that reality is, we will add nothing to it.
Mm-hmm.
The idea is to suggest. And I'm wondering if what you are trying to suggest, I just want to check it against the readers, what I got out of the book. Are you consciously aware that you're trying to suggest something? And if so, what is it in the first bunch of them?
You mean in the writing?
Yes.
Oh, that's a very good question. Yes, I am. And it's very hard to say what those things are. But maybe I describe it like this. And that's what I meant when I said to Joseph that I feel in service, in the sense that I feel slightly behind the text. And that's exactly where I want to be. I don't enjoy reading books where I can feel the writer is ahead of the text, where the writer possesses a knowledge that is outside and extra to the text. I don't like those kind of books, and I want to try not to write those kind of books. So what I enjoy is when I feel that the writer is just behind the text, and that's where the relationship of the suggestion comes in. That, in other words, to write a novel is to try to remain in a state of absolute freedom, but also a state of absolute vulnerability. And and another way of describing what I mean by prose that reads as if the writer is slightly ahead of the text is I don't feel that they're risking enough, or I don't feel that they're either free enough or vulnerable enough to think that there's actually an event taking place here. You know? I'm not suggesting that's what I've succeeded in doing. I have no idea. I can't judge it, but that's what I try to do. And that's again what I mean by a place, you know, by a state of that's where it comes from. It's been very interesting spending the last 3 months in academia. It's not a usual place for me. And in academia, there seems to be a difficulty with this issue, I feel. Because I don't know why. I don't know why, but there seems to be a difficulty. I mean, we can hypothesize about why, but maybe because one of the reasons why it's difficult is because it's not very easy to define it, and then you end up into this very tricky territory of, you know, inspiration. Where's it coming from? It's coming from somewhere else. All this stuff. Yeah.
Well, another academic difficulty. I don't know if I recall precisely what Hannah said about your writing in English rather than Arabic. That it is freeing. Is that the term?
It's
freeing, right? Is that what you said?
Yeah, I mean, I disown everything I've said. I stand by nothing I've said. But yes, I mean, on some level, maybe freeing is one of the words one can use about it. I suppose what I was trying to talk about is, you know, the problem. I feel there is I have a problem with not writing in Arabic. It doesn't sit easily. It's not something that I have completely resolved. So I am forever I'm forever trying to figure out why I'm writing in English. I mean, there are some very practical reasons. You know, my English is better than my Arabic, and when you're writing, you want to use your best tool and all that. But they're not quite convincing to myself, those reasons, even though they're reasonable reasons. The reason that seems to be convincing to me is that writing in English gives me a kind of distance from the thing, from the subject. That paradox makes me able to write, to risk more, makes me able to be, you know, more vulnerable, in a state of more freedom and more vulnerability, in a sense, no? And also I think one of the projects, you know, embedded in the project of dictatorship, and I think also particularly within the Libyan project, is a desire to retard you, to make you either afraid, silent, you can't speak, or to actually physically kill you, or cut your tongue literally, or, you know, or to imprison you, or to make you so angry that even the people who are sympathetic with you don't want to hear what you have to say, you know? And so there seems to me embedded in that is a desire to retard society and the individual and the artist. And so it then becomes a very interesting exercise, artistic exercise, to write as calmly and as precisely as possible, but also to write through restraint. That the power of what you're saying is coming through what is not said. That seemed to me a very interesting thing to try to do in prose. And would I be able to do it in Arabic? Possibly. I don't know. I haven't tried. But writing through another language gives me that sort of distance.
But why does it give you courage? Why can't courage be garnered in through Arabic, for example?
I don't know.
Because it seems to me that again, I'm sorry that it is a bit picky in terms of academic philosophy. That would seem to me that unless it's really a choice of yours, it seems to me to bolster and enforce or reinforce the problem of translation which we have with that particular society among other societies.
As a writer of fiction, as a writer of novels, I don't feel I have a duty to, with all honesty, I don't feel I have a duty to anybody or anything. I feel my entire being, my entire intellect, my circumstantial details of my life are all in devotion to the book that I'm writing. And if this is what the book needs, then I give it. Now, this is me as an artist, but me as a citizen, everything changes. I write some journalism and so on. Everything changes there. There I do feel a responsibility as a citizen and an obligation, but not as a novelist. I don't.
Yes, maybe it's a follow-up question, maybe not. It's, I want to ask you about violence in this distance, and probably about the audience of the books, since they are written in English. How is it that you describe a violence that is very, very visceral, very corporeal, very real? I mean, everybody can actually sympathize, understand that kind of violence. On the other hand, though, the people who are reading these books, I don't want to generalize, but they live in societies where violence is actually much, much more difficult to describe. It goes much deeper, and it's not that exoticizable, if you like. So how is it that people read your books having this sense of violence that you describe, which is tangible for everyone, but at the same time, they imagine that this violence doesn't really exist only in these places that are under dictatorship?
Well, it depends. I mean, maybe you're assuming that my work is outright in the Arabic world. Is that what you mean?
No, I mean, it's also, of course, it's also involved. But I understand that people who read it in the Arab world can understand exactly, understand it in a different way. They have a different concept of violence in that sense, maybe. If you live under dictatorship, I guess, the way that people understand violence, it's another way than if you live under a liberal dictatorship, or a liberal, democracy.
I'm not sure about that, actually. I'm not sure. I mean, it's very general. It depends where you, it depends which country, which language. I'm not sure that's true. I mean, I have readers in Latin America who completely connect with this. To them, it's very, and they connect for certain reasons. I have readers in Sweden who have connected with it, but they've connected for a completely different reason.
That's exactly what I'm asking. What kind of reasons you think they connect with in Sweden?
I don't know. I don't know. But I doubt that it's over this issue of violence. I mean, perhaps, but hard for me to say. Hard for me to say.
I wanted to ask you, what do you feel is the psychological legacy of children who are being raised in the West, such as the United States or the UK, but if parents have fled brutal dictatorships, societies where you can disappear, and the impact that has. I've noticed that in college I had a lot of things in common with people from Eastern Europe. Your parents tell you not to tell your cousins, not to keep secrets, the secretive nature. Then you always feel that your parents are weird until as you get older you realize that well, they used to live in a society where people would disappear if they said the wrong people. So I wanted to talk to you about your choice of using children, the point of view of children, and also the legacy of children who are raised not in the parents' environment, but maybe their parents have inadvertently passed down some of the things onto their kids.
Well, children seem to, although in both books actually they're adults who recall in particular moments of their childhood. Children seem, that time seems to be incredibly vivid, and everything is so new and fresh and intense. And also, it's perhaps the last sort of state of mysticism that any of us are likely to experience. If mysticism is the idea of living totally in the present, so it makes perfect sense to me why a child, for example, would collapse in tantrums when their toy breaks, because it is the last toy. It's the only toy that exists. And so that sort of sense of intensity of experience seemed to allow me, in the narrative, a lot of facility to be able to say the things I wanted to say and to describe the sort of reality that these people live in. They don't, this child, their perception of the reality in Libya at that time is made worse by the fact that he can't remember any other time. It is everything, It is, and so that's, but about language and identity, I suppose. I try, these questions are all very interesting to me. The question of identity and language and place and one's history and our generation of people that have grown up in a different place and so on. I'm interested in them, but I'm also slightly resistant to focusing on them too much. I'll tell you why. Because I think that we live in a time where we're obsessed with identity, and we're obsessed with divisions, and we're obsessed with identity has sort of become this kind of lovely, sort of cozy armchair that everybody wants. And it seems to me that, I'm a universalist. I'm much more interested in, and to me it's absurd that anybody has to say this person is black or white, or this person is gay or straight. The whole notion seems absurd, on some level. And so, maybe in a very naive way, I sort of try to navigate out of what I think is a trap. It's a well-intended, it's well-meaning trap, but nevertheless it's a trap. Yeah.
I just finished reading the book, and there were a few moments that I was just like in the book that I was amazed at, because the experience of him as a child, I related to a lot of those, just these small details of his life and things that he used to feel towards his mother and towards his situation in general. And I grew up in a totally different situation, but I just thought it was amazing that there would be things mentioned in the book that he was thinking, and I would literally gasp because I'd be I thought I was the only one that did that when I was a kid, or thought those things when I was a kid. So I think that, yeah, in that sense, there is that sort of universality achieved. We actually, in my class we were discussing the book, and we had a discussion about one of those moments, and a lot of people would be interpreting it as through the context of the time that he was growing up in, the revolution, and things like that. And really, I just stopped to say, I felt exactly, the same, but just it's, maybe it doesn't have to be so much about his circumstance, but just about being a kid. So yeah, so I think in a lot of ways, you did achieve that.
Thank you.
Okay, I mean, I actually have two comments relating to Joseph's question and the question concerning the choice of language in which to write. In terms of what you refer to within both books as Arabic literature, I've noticed that there is, you engage poetry, specifically Arabic poetry. I mean, there's Salah Abd al-Sabur in Country of Men, and Badr Shakir al-Sayab in Anatomy of a Disappearance. So I was wondering why it is that the text seems to veer towards poetry rather than prose. Joseph was mentioning prose texts. Why you dialogue with poetry more, Arabic poetry? That's one question.
Well, my reading has been mainly in poetry. So growing up, I only really read poems. Not only that, but growing up, I only thought literature was poetry. Novels were a corruption of literature. And articles were not to be read. So I read, and that was largely because of the library we had at home, that it was mainly, we mainly had poems. And of course I read novels at school, but the first novel that I read as an adult, so just going to read a novel for pleasure. I was 19 or 20, So up to then, all I read were poetry, poetry or verse, the classics, all the verse, and I wanted to be a poet, and all of my literary ambition was in poetry, and in fact, in the Country of Men started as a poem. And 2-3 years before that, all the poems that I was attempting to write were so obviously concerned with telling stories. They were narrative poems. One Sunday morning, I sat down to write a poem about a boy in the garden picking mulberries. Yeah. And I thought, this is a poem about a boy in the garden, discovering nature and himself through it. And I would, it would take me 3 weeks, 14 lines, I'd be done. It might even be decent. And that scene is now in the sort of 40 pages into the book. And so that was a huge discovery for me, because it wasn't necessarily a digression. It wasn't that I was writing poetry, and then, oops, oh, this poem now is a novel. No, it made sense of my obsessions as a boy and as a young man. I was very interested in poetry, music. I actually wanted to be a conductor. This was my dream, still my dream. It's a terrible thing, but it'll never happen. But so I wanted to be a conductor. I wanted to be a poet, and I was interested in buildings, so I became an architect. But those three things, what fascinated me and continues to fascinate me about those three things, they're all in novels. And so I regard myself as hugely lucky that I suddenly, this conundrum that I had for years, which was, I'm not necessarily a very good poet, I'm a terrible musician, I'm an okay architect, and I wanted to do something that pleased me, something that I felt was really pushing against the limits of what I could do, and maybe even sometimes going beyond it. These are magical moments in writing prose. It only happens very occasionally. But there are moments when you're writing and there's this 2 minutes of writing where you've run ahead of yourself. And there's this paragraph that you never thought, you never expected to write. And those are magical moments. And so that kind of sense of exceeding one's own expectations or abilities or knowledge, I never got in architecture. And so there was a disappointment, and so I wanted, to. So those three things are there. And that's why poetry remains to be a deep passion.
Great. And another question, even in the passage that you read, there was an Egyptian expression, I'm expecting perhaps it's Libyan too, that was translated something to the effect of from your mouth to the gate of heaven.
Yeah.
And in an anatomy of a disappearance, there's something similar, that you have an Egyptian character, an illiterate man, who could not disentangle a line, as the saying goes in Egypt.
Absolutely.
So I noticed these moments where you are Arabizing English, if you approve of that way of putting it. And this may respond to the question that was raised about language choice, and I was wondering if you could comment about that. And also, is it not the case that your first novel, In the Country of Men, has been translated into Arabic?
Yes, I'm actually, well, there was a first attempt, and it was published in a translation that I didn't approve of. It wasn't very, it was, you know, the prose in The Country of Men is sort of, it's got a wire of grief that undercuts it. And so there are moments when deliberately there's very little said. And my Arabic translator felt, no, she started throwing in all these adjectives. It was a disaster. And so now I have a new publisher and a new translator who's translating both books, but Anatomy is coming out first. And it's been actually quite interesting working with him. And he's somebody that I chose, so it's been very exciting. Working with him on it, and it does feel like a rewrite of some sort. And I've always maintained that actually translation, people bemoan translation, you're reading it through a fogged mirror and all this stuff. But actually, sometimes translation is better than the original. I think sometimes you get two very good writers, working on the same text, and you get something sometimes better. So
And what about the Arabization of English? Just to what extent?
I don't know. I just feel like every time I try to make sense of why I do this or that, I make less sense to myself about it. In the sense that writing novels, I don't sit, I don't know any novelist who sits and says, okay, now which language shall I choose to write this novel in? What is this novel going to be about? Shall I write about this or shall I write about that? I mean, certainly that's not the case for me. It starts viscerally, and I work, and these things come in. So I don't know. I really do feel that you're probably better placed to answer that.
And you mentioned sort of how you're a committed universalist. So I was wondering if you saw your writing in English about an Arab experience, or representing an Arab experience, as a translation of an Arab experience, because at the level of affect is universal and therefore can be communicated in perhaps the most universal of languages, being English, or is it that you felt you are actually translating something particular, which you found translatable into English, rather than necessarily universal?
No, I don't feel I'm translating anything. I mean, every time someone says, this person, like, New York Times said something about me as being, perfectly poised to translate that. So what needs to be translated? It seems to me perfectly obvious that life here or there is pretty much the same, that all one needs is, is to engage with it. And so no, I don't feel I am translating a cultural experience or reality. But I do feel that I am trying to unravel certain states of being, depending on what it is that I'm trying to write. I'm trying to unpack something that seems to me full of contradictions and full of conflicting empathies, and that's what not translating, but trying to meditate or explore it further. Not for someone. See, the trouble with translating is that the intent is for someone else. No, it's sort of translate for that person. But what I'm trying to do is not necessarily for anyone. It's I don't know who I'm doing it for, but I know in that moment I'm ultimately doing it for myself. Trying to meditate over this region of emotional, psychological landscape, and trying to understand it better, or to maybe understand is not even the right word, but to make it part of something else, of a structure that is hopefully pleasing and beautiful and interesting and gives pleasure, but also and delight, but also that engages the intellect as well. So, in other words, you know, poetry and philosophy, ideas and music, you know. So, but ultimately, I suppose I'm doing it for myself. I mean, I think it was Borges who somebody asked him, said, "Who do you write? You know, why do you write?" Because I write for myself and for my friends, and to ease the passage of time. But I think Hemingway his was better, which is I write for myself, and for the woman I love, even if she can't read. That in a sense, writing is an act of love. Only a couple of times in my life I have felt a complete absence of love.
Complete absence?
Of love. I had no love. I had love for nothing. I had love for no one. I had love for not for nature, not for music, not for poetry. I couldn't read a poem. And
Anhedonia.
There was something incredibly dark and comfortable about it, as if what I would imagine it would feel like falling off a building. So just those moments, and in that state, I had no desire to create anything, no desire to make any, not even a decent cup of coffee. I had no desire to make anything, and also no desire to engage with anything that is created. No desire to stop and look at a tree didn't notice the moon, didn't notice the sun. No, so that's what I mean by that writing for me is an act of love. Is that only when I am in love, and I don't mean in love just with a person, but in love in the more general sense, that I feel the drive and the desire to create. And when I read work that I admire and love, or when I look at a painting that I like, or hear a symphony that I like, I feel that in it. And I feel it inspiring that back in me. So it comes out of love, and that's why ultimately it is an act of praise, I think. So those things that that I'm trying to describe, those things that I'm trying to unpack and meditate on, I am praising them at the same moment. You know, that the only way you could write about a despot, or the only way you could write something incredibly awful, is to be at the same time praising it and being in love with everything in it. And the only time that you can write, something beautiful is the same. So praise in the sense of recognition, not in the sense of but in the sense of recognition. I mean, sometimes it starts with a feeling or a gesture or a sentence or an image. But anatomy for me started with a feeling for Nouri Levit's character. I knew nothing about him. I didn't even know how he looked like. Even now, if he were sitting here, I wouldn't know. I wouldn't recognize him. I just know he was slim and tall and dark, but nothing else. But I had a feeling for him. By that I mean I sort of knew what it would be like sitting next to him. His presence, the quality of his silence. And I wrote around that for about a year, trying to find access into this feeling, very vague feeling. And it was after a year of writing that I hit on the first sentence, and I recognized it. That has in it the tempo of his speech, the quality of his thinking, but also his silence, which to me is very important to know the silence of the character. And it is the first sentence of the book. There are times when my father's absence is as heavy as a child sitting on my chest. Other times I can barely recall the exact features of his face and must bring out the photographs I keep in an old envelope in the drawer of my bedside table. There has not been a day since his sudden and mysterious vanishing that I have not been searching for him, looking in the most unlikely places. Everything and everyone, existence itself, has become an evocation, a possibility for resemblance. Perhaps this is what is meant by that brief and now almost archaic word, elegy. I do not see him in the mirror, but feel him adjusting as if he were twisting within a shirt that nearly fits. My father has always been intimately mysterious, even when he was present. I can almost imagine how it might have been coming to him as an equal, as a friend, but not quite. My father disappeared in 1972 at the beginning of my school Christmas holiday when I was 14. Mona and I were staying at the Montevo Palace, taking breakfast, I with my large glass of bright orange juice, and she with her steaming black tea on the terrace overlooking the steel blue surface of Lake Geneva, at the other end of which, beyond the hills and the bending waters, lay the now vacant city of Geneva. I was watching the silent paragliders hover above the still lake, and she was paging through Le Tribune de Genève when suddenly her hand rose to her mouth and trembled. A few minutes later, we were aboard a train, hardly speaking, passing the newspaper back and forth. We collected from the police station the few belongings that were left on the bedside table. When I unsealed the small plastic bag, along with the tobacco and the lighter flint, I smelled him. That same watch is now wrapped around my wrist, and even today, after all these years, when I press the underside of the leather strap against my nostrils, I can detect a whiff of him. I wonder now how different my story would have been were Mona's hands unbeautiful, her fingertips coarse. I still, all of these years later, hear the same childish persistence. I saw her first, which bounced like a devil on my tongue whenever I caught one of Father's claiming gestures, his fingers sinking into her hair, his hand landing on her skirted thigh with the absent-mindedness of a man touching his earlobe in mid-sentence. He had taken to the Western habit of holding hands, kissing, embracing in public, but he could not fool me. Like a bad actor, he seemed unsure of his steps. Whenever he would catch me watching him, he would look away, and I swear I could see color in his cheeks. A dark tenderness rises in me now as I think how hard he had tried, how I yearn still for an easy sympathy with my father. Our relationship lacked what I have always believed possible, given time, and perhaps after I had become a man, after he had seen me become a father, a kind of emotional eloquence and ease. But now the distances that had then governed our interactions and cut a quiet gap between us continue to shape him in my thoughts. We met Mona at the Magda Marina, a small hotel in Alexandria's Agani beach. Although the sea was nearby, we did not swim in it, and I never asked to build sandcastles. Most of the guests, too, ignored it and were content with the shelter and limited pleasures of the swimming pool. The concrete box structures in the single-story rooms screened us from the surrounding landscape. You could hear the waves lapping lazily against the shore like a snoring guard dog, but we caught only narrow glimpses of the blueness. Father had been bringing me here for the past 2 summers, ever since Mother's sudden passing. We never came to places such as the Magda Marina when my mother was alive. She did not like the heat. I never saw her in a swimsuit or in sudden surrender, closing her eyes at the sun. The coming of Kyrie's spring would set her off planning our summer getaways. Once we summered high up in the Swiss Alps where my body stiffened at the sight of deep, hollow chasms emptied out of the rocky earth. Another time she took us to Nordland, northern Norway, where austere black mountains reflected sharply their splintered peaks on the unmoving waters. We stayed in a wooden cabin that stood alone by the water and was painted the brown red of withered leaves. Round its roof hung a gutter as wide as a human thigh. Here, whatever fell from the sky fell in abundance. There was no other man-made structure in sight. Some afternoons Mother disappeared, and I would not let on to Father that my heart was thumping at the base of my ears. I would keep to my room until I heard footsteps on the deck and the kitchen door slide open. Once, I found her there with hands stained black red, a rough globe dyed into the front of her sweater. With eyes as clean as glass, wide, satisfied, she held out a handful of wild berries. They tasted of a ripe sweetness I found hard to attribute to that landscape. One night, fog gathered thickly, abstracting the licks and sighs of the northern lights. You need adulthood to appreciate such horror. An anxious heat entered my 8-year-old mind, and I curled up in bed, trying to muffle the crying, hoping Mother would pay me one of her night visits, kiss my forehead, lie beside me. In the morning, the still world returned, the innocent waters, the ferocious mountains, the pale sky dotted with small newborn clouds. I found her in the kitchen warming milk, a glass of water standing on the white marble counter beside her. Not juice, tea, coffee, but water was her morning drink. She took a sip and with her usual insistence on soundlessness, muffled the impact with the soft tip of her little finger. Any sudden sound unsettled her. She could conduct an entire day's chores in near silence. I sat at the rented table where, when the three of us gathered at mealtimes, Mother would occasionally glance at the fourth empty chair as if it signaled an absence, something lost. She poured the hot milk, a sliver of steam brushed the air, then disappeared beside her neck. "Why the long face?" she said. She took me out onto the deck that stretched above the lake. The air was so brisk it stung my throat. We stood in silence. I remembered what she had said to Father in the car when the naked mountains of Nordland first came into view. Here God decided to be a sculptor. Everywhere else he holds back. Holds back, Father had echoed. You talk about him as if he's a friend of yours. In those days, Father did not believe in God. He often greeted Mother's remembrances of the divine with irritated sarcasm. Perhaps I should not have been surprised when, after Mother died, he would now and again voice a prayer. Sarcasm, more often than not, hides a secret fascination. Was it the romance of wood fires, the discretion of heavy coats that attracted my mother to the north and unpeopled places of Europe? Or was it the impeccable stillness of a fortnight spent mostly sheltered indoors with the only two people she could lay claim to? I have come to think of those holidays, no matter where they were, as having taken place in a single country, her country, and the silences that marked them, her melancholy. There were moments when her unhappiness seemed as elemental as clear water. After she died, it soon became obvious that what Father had always wanted to do in the 2 weeks he allowed himself off every summer was to lie in the sun all day. So the Magda Marina became the place where he and I spent that fortnight. He seemed to have lost his way with me. Widowhood had dispossessed him of any ease that he had once had around his only child. When we sat down to eat, he either read the paper or gazed into the distance. Whenever he noticed me looking at him, he would fidget or check his watch. As soon as he had finished eating, he would light a cigarette and snap his fingers for the bill, not bothering to see whether I had finished too. "See you back in the room," he would say. He never did that when Mother was alive. Instead, when the three of us went to a restaurant, they would sit side by side facing me. If we were all engaged in some conversation, she would direct most of her contributions toward me, as if I were the front wall of a squash court. And when his unease led him to play the entertainer, she would monitor, in that discreet way of hers, my reactions to his forced cheerfulness, or, if he could bear it no longer, to his vast silences. With Mother's eyes on me, I would watch Father, observe the other patrons, or stare out at the view, which was often of some unremarkable street or square, no doubt daydreaming or plotting his next move in the secret work I never once heard him talk about. At these moments, it felt as if he were the boy obliged to pass a meal with adults, that he was the son and I the father. After she passed away, he and I came to resemble two flat-sharing bachelors, kept together by circumstance or obligation. But then, that tender-hearted sympathy, raw and sudden, would rise in him at the most unexpected moments, and he would plunge his face into my neck, sniff deeply and kiss, tickling me with his mustache. It would set us off laughing as though everything were all right. It is true. I did see Mona first. She was sitting on the ceramic tiles that surrounded the rectangular swimming pool at the Magda Marina, looking at the underside of her foot. The tiles were decorated in a pattern that many years later, on a trip to Granada, I learned was a factory copy of a wall mosaic at Alhambra. When I saw the my mind returned to that distant summer's day of 1971 in Alexandria, when I was 12. Her hair was tied sensibly in a ponytail, and she had on an outrageously bright yellow swimsuit that made her skin seem darker, her age younger. For a moment, I thought her a girl. For a moment, the yellow strap running across her back brought to mind the yellow hospital bracelet that had been bound round my mother's wrist. The light shimmered blue and weakly off the water and onto Muna's body. This bit of skin is Arab. This from your English mother. I would later come to tease her. She was pulling her ankle, arching her neck, the ridge of her spine pressing against the yellow strap. Thinking back on it now, I'm envious of the confidence with which I had approached her, as if I were crossing the road to the aid of a turtle on its back. Such natural self-assuredness has since eluded me. Whereas father managed to shake off that cloak of shyness over the years, mine only got heavier. I sat cross-legged beside her on the tiles and, without asking permission, placed a complaining foot in my lap. I proceeded to inspect each toe. She did not resist. Then, embedded in the soft underside of one toe, I found it, a brown speck of a thorn fading into the pink flesh. Last week, I told her, turning her foot in order to gain a better angle, the same thing happened to me. It drove me crazy the whole day until I couldn't stand it any longer, and just before going to bed, I pulled it out. I captured the thorn between two fingernails. She flinched, but I did not draw back. Just like that, I said, and held it on the tip of my forefinger to show her. Our heads were so close now that I could feel a strand of her hair touch my temple. Thank you, she said in an angular Arabic. I could see now that her shoulders had eased. What is your name? It was an English accent, I was sure. She ran her hand down my cheek, then held my chin and gazed at me. She had inconstant eyes, brown, green, and silver all at once. Nouri, I finally said, pulling away. Nouri el-Alfi. Pleasure to meet you, Nouri el-Alfi, she said, and smiled a smile I could not understand. I walked back to where father was sunbathing. Now he had his broad chest propped up on his elbows. Who is she? He asked, his eyes on her. I thought of running back to ask her name, but she stood up, slid two fingers beneath the bottom of the swimsuit, and stretched the fabric around her buttocks. The pattern of the ceramic tiles was faintly imprinted on the underside of one thigh. She turned towards us. I wondered if she was looking at me or at father, or at us both, perhaps. Then she went to sit at a table where a glass of lemonade had been waiting. Father reclined, his elbows red with pressure, and closed his eyes. Under a perfectly cropped mustache, his lips stretched into a precise smile, knowing or ironic, as if he was satisfied at his own intelligence, at having figured out her riddle in half the time. She looked our way again, lit a cigarette, then pretended to be looking elsewhere. Finally, she closed her eyes at the sun. I watched her now without restraint. I wanted to wear her as you would a piece of clothing, to fold into her ribs, be a stone in her mouth. I made as if I were walking around the pool to watch her from all angles. Suddenly she opened her eyes. Unsurprised, unmoving, she stared at me. She came to the pool's edge, dipped one foot in the water, then the other, and tiptoed away. I watched the trail of wet prints evaporate. The glass of lemonade was still there, patient and full. One of the sweating waiters, dressed in black bow tie and waistcoat, took it away. I regretted not beating him to it. How wonderful it would have been to drink something intended for her. And I found father turned on his stomach, the wood slats of the sun lounger marked red across his back.